I see that. Okay.
Hello.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Good. All right, we
Please.
are live now. This is AACE Brazil Connection. It's a new program by AACE Brazil section in which we every month invite a different expert or authority or author or executive of an important country or organization or company from outside of Brazil. And our intention is to bring to our community best practices, case studies. And tonight we are delighted to have the presence of our president, Mr. Chris Cadell. Dear Chris, it's an honor for us to have you here. Welcome and thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to your members. So thank you. I think, do you want me to just chime in and see if Philippe joins in a minute or, there he is.
Excellent. And this is the only AACE section in the world that has an international director. And our director is
Felipe Gutierrez. Hi, Aldo.
Felipe is here. I think Felipe, yeah. As I was telling you, this is the only section in the world that has an international director, who is our our dear Felipe Gutierrez, who will be conducting this interview or this webinar about a subject that is very opportune, that is up to date, that it's very important, and that entails a lot of discussions, which is the impact of COVID-19 in construction contracts. So, Philippe, now it's with you. Please lead us in this presentation by our president, Chris Cadell.
Thank you so much, Aldo. Thank you, everybody, for being here today with us. Apologies again. I'm sure Aldo was apologizing before while I was having issues as well to connect. Hopefully, we can make the most out of the remainder of the time. And this should be an opportunity for us to have a little bit of fun, to get to know a bit better Chris, and also to learn a little bit as well from what he's been doing and what he's been doing in a professional capacity here in the United States. So, Chris, welcome. It's a great pleasure having you, and I hope you're doing well. How's everything?
Everything's going really well. I've got a countdown clock for my role as president, so I'm just counting down the days to when I can go back to having only one job.
Fair enough. Yeah. That's actually the first question I was going to ask. How you're feeling and how has it been? The entire cycle, because after all, it's a cycle where you started in a situation where things were very different than they are now, right?
It has. I think I'm probably the first AACE president who never traveled as a part of their tenure in this role. So it's been an interesting year. I think we've had a lot of challenges. It started when Doug Leo was president last year. I think he found it particularly challenging. He was president during the start of the pandemic, and I think we were all still trying to figure out what this would mean for the organization. But one of the things we were doing that really just became much more crystallized as a result of the pandemic was taking a strategic look at the association and maybe what we needed to do going forward to help the association evolve. We were still doing things in many ways the way they'd been done for decades. And I think the working world has changed, the digital environment and people being able to participate in venues like this as opposed to in person has really changed the paradigm of how people work and how people want to interact. So when we started with Doug, we were starting to look at the organization, and one of my key priorities for this year was to shepherd through a vote for the new bylaws for the association, which really, which thankfully passed. And I think one of the great things about that is it gives the organization a little more flexibility in terms of how we set up ways to interact with our members around the world. You know, before we've had this one paradigm and we were using it the same way everywhere, but it didn't always work the same way everywhere, or at least not as effectively. So now we can play with that a little bit, and you know, maybe we've got sections set up with one set of criteria for North America, and maybe we have another set for different countries depending on the regulations or requirements there. So we're really excited about this going forward. And there's a lot more work to be done that will happen to me, but that's how the year has gone so far.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I guess what I find it interesting is that, you know, one aspect that you mentioned is that now we are in a new reality and it's the same or similar to everybody, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the important things we will surely get out of this conversation from you is that, you know, things that are being done elsewhere can be learned more quickly and more on a more streamlined basis elsewhere. So hopefully, you know, you'll be able to share some of these fantastic experiences you've been going throughout the year.
Yeah, it was interesting. I know I was talking to someone just earlier today. I guess it was about 15 years ago, I did a project review of a project in India, but due to circumstances, I was not able to travel there. So we did it by video conference. But at that point in time, the technology wasn't as developed. The quality of the video was very poor. The quality of the audio was not that good. And I think that was not one of my better reviews as a result. But now you can talk with anyone in any part of the world, and it's as if you're in the same room in many ways.
Yeah, exactly. Nice. And I mean, perhaps in terms of perspective, and I guess this is supposed to be really a conversation. So, you know, I've listed a couple of items we can go through. You're more than welcome to just answer and come up with more ideas and matters. I was wondering, you know, what were you doing? I mean, if you want to contrast what you were doing just before the pandemic and I guess throughout and now, can you do like a phased approach to us how things are going? Yeah.
So before the pandemic, I was traveling extensively. The airlines liked me a lot. I was a frequent traveler with United Airlines, traveling around the world. What I've been doing for many years is project reviews, risk assessments. And in fact, the very last trip I made was to Madrid for Repsol, doing a review of a project in Portugal. And I was there in early March and left the country the day before the US restricted travel back into the country from Europe. And since then, so that was March 11th of last year, I have not taken another business trip since then. So everything's been from home, but I've been busy, so that's good. I've been gainfully employed, so that's I've not had to suffer as many people that we all know have struggled with. The oil and gas industry, a lot of reductions there, and other industries have been hurt significantly. Thankfully, I've been able to keep quite busy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and you just mentioned the industry specific, and understand you had more oil and gas experience during a number of years, and now coincidentally, more recently, you kind of focus more your activities in another industry, right?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about it.
So I after the pandemic hit, my first activity was for Turner and Townsend. So we're a project management consulting firm. We help mostly owners, but occasionally contractors also. One of the things we were doing was putting together some guidelines to issue to clients to help them understand or make sense of all of the impacts that they were going to be seeing out of COVID. And so it was just kind of some generic, here's some things you need to think about. Here's how you might want to handle some of the impacts that you're going to see on your projects, and just give them that guidance to help them manage all of this as they go through it. And then I got tapped specifically in April to help Google manage their data center program claims that they were getting from, or they were anticipating to be getting from contractors across their portfolio. It's a wide program with projects all around the world, from North America to Europe to Asia to Latin America. And it was a monumental effort to try and coordinate all of that. So that's what I've mostly been doing for the last year.
Interesting. And why did they, I mean, you mentioned the company, right? Google, they build a lot, and they've been doing this for a little while already. So they obviously know this stuff, right? So why was it that they had to hire an independent firm to help them? And what was the objective? What did they had in mind?
I think they had I mean, there were a few different reasons I think that they wanted to bring someone in to help them with this. One was they run a relatively lean organization, so they didn't have a lot of excess capacity in terms of people to just manage all of this influx of claims that they were going to have. They also they work a lot with their contractors and believe strongly in a partnering approach with them. So they don't have a lot of claims experience per se on their projects around the world. So they wanted to bring in some people that had expertise in that area to just really focus on those claims and really help keep from bogging down the projects, if I could name it like that, so that they could continue to focus on delivering the projects. I mean, most of the projects continued on. They didn't shut down, with only a couple of exceptions. And so they were still, the project teams were still working hard to deliver those projects and keep them on track and progressing. So they wanted to set up kind of a separate team outside of the projects that could manage these claims and look at them. But then also, because they do have a partnering, they also use some of the same contractors across multiple projects. So they wanted to make sure that they had some consistency in how they addressed claims across the entire program. So they didn't want to have, on one project, one contractor gets paid for this, and on another project, they get denied for that same impact. They wanted to make sure they were treating all the contractors the same, no matter where they were.
And that's very good. I mean, that's very aligned with best practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
You learn obviously from one experience. You want to share whatever you do well, and you want to avoid repeating bad experiences. That's really good. And did it happen? I mean, they were, as you said, they were expecting to have all those claims, COVID-related claims. Well,
They did. They definitely got a lot of claims in. I think they fell into, in fact, we categorized them into two separate types of impacts. One was an actual mitigation response. I think most of the governments around the world impose certain recommendations or requirements in some cases about how projects needed to continue to work. They needed to practice social distancing. They recommended temperature screening, wearing a mask, and things like that. So that was one set of claims, or contractor requests, I should say. They weren't really claims, where they said, we were impacted because we had to add additional sanitation facilities. We added personal protection equipment, PPE. We added some supervisors in some cases to, because we were dividing where people could work and we were keeping them in zones. We were adding trailer facilities because the people in the offices needed to sit farther apart. All of those types of changes, and the temperature screening, like I said, that was one set. And then the other set were impacts more of like loss of productivity, schedule prolongation, or delays. That was another set that really required more study and analysis to look at those, to figure out what was the actual impact in all of this. But I think Google at least took a great approach of really trying to make the contractors whole as much as possible, and reimburse them for all reasonable costs associated with the pandemic, be it either some of these mitigation response actions or productivity impacts. I think their main requirement was that the contractor did have a burden of proof. You needed to be able to demonstrate these costs. So you needed to be able to provide invoices for the cleaning supplies, for implementing daily cleaning regimes. And you needed to provide costs. Sometimes they had to add equipment on the job site because you could no longer have two people use a lift. You could only have one in a lift at a time. So they would rent more lifts. So those types of things, it was really just a matter of providing invoices and things like that. The productivity side was a lot more challenging, where you're trying to get a contractor to demonstrate that they had a productivity impact. A lot of the contractors were not necessarily really tracking their workers and the productivity at a level of detail that really allowed them to do that. So that's when it became a little more challenging at reviewing some of those.
And did you guys happen to help the contractors, like presenting it in a more structured way, or in a way that Google would accept it more easily?
I won't say we helped the contractors per se, but we did develop a set of guidelines. We said, if you have a productivity impact, here's how you need to present that. If you have a schedule impact, here's how you need to do the time impact analysis to show us that you've been impacted by this, either something with the pandemic or some other activity. How you demonstrate that was directly as a result of the pandemic. So no, we didn't. We did issue guidelines.
It is, in my mind, it is a very, very good and fair way to help, right? And you're telling them, this is how I want to see the information. Make sure you have that, and then we can talk, right? That's I can tell it's not. I think I've seen a lot of owners being proactive and trying to help the contractors, but I wouldn't say that was the rule. So that's very good.
Well, they actually, it was funny, they did have a company come in to do an audit and just in general on their project management practices. And one of the things they audited was how we were handling the COVID response to all of those contractor requests. And the auditor said from their experience with looking at other contractor or other owners, that Google was being much more reasonable or generous in some cases in terms of what they were compensating contractors for. I mean, I know we've seen other instances where the owner says, you know, this was a force majeure event, we'll give you time, but no compensation. And Google was, because they have these long relationships with many of these contractors and intend on continuing that relationship for many years into the future, you know, wanted to make sure that the contractors were not significantly impacted. They didn't, one of their rules that they did set was, we don't want anyone profiting off of the pandemic. So one of the things we did actually was kind of in looking at the contracts, because they had all the contracts that they have across their portfolio follow a similar theme, but there are differences between them. But we set up a set of general positions of what Google would pay for, what Google would not pay for. And just made sure that everyone was familiar with that and understood that. So when we looked at this, depending on whoever was looking at a particular claim, they would have this guidance of what Google was willing to pay for and what they weren't. So that helped a lot, I think, just in terms of making sure that we were all aligned and being consistent in how we were responding to these requests.
Yes. Did you, I mean, I'll be interested to know, and I think the public as well, the audience, I would say, in terms of success of this program, you know, I'm sure there will be cases where it was not, you know, specific case where it was not as successful, others that were, you know, great success. Can you tell us, can you navigate a little bit through that to know how successful was the overall program, and if there was still cases that even after all this effort, you know, it's probably still, you know, taking ADR or some other sort of you know, way to deal with those differences, with those claims? Are they being resolved through arbitration or else?
Yeah, I guess it's how you measure success can be questionable and may differ depending on your perspective. I think success for Google might look a little different than maybe success for the contractors in some cases. And, you know, certainly I think we had a percentage, a general percentage reduction between this is how much the contractors asked for and this was how much was approved. So from that perspective, maybe the contractors wouldn't see it as successful as maybe Google did. But I guess the one measure of success was none of the projects to date, at least, there are a number of, you know, obviously the impacts are still ongoing across most of the projects, but none of the projects to date have come to a grinding halt because of this. None of the contractors have gone out of business because they didn't have cash flow. We've been trying to turn these over in a reasonable amount of time, so it kept contractors from being severely impacted in their cash flow. None of the contractors have ever elevated any of these requests or, you know, to a dispute or arbitration or mediation or litigation. So all of them have been resolved one way or the other. I think there were definitely some instances where the contractors didn't necessarily get everything that they asked for or that they thought they deserved. And I think there are instances where Google felt like they probably gave more than what the contractor was able to demonstrate, but they did that in good faith. So maybe one measure of success is, and this is, you know, kind of a rule in most claims, and when you reach a settlement, if no one's happy, then it must have been a good settlement. I think, you know, it was successful in many ways of just really keeping the projects moving forward and progressing and able to reach a settlement of some sort on all of these requests.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in my mind, having the projects delivered, it's a great indicator of success, right? I mean, and you're telling us, you know, that there were no additional complicated, costly, dispute resolution. That's to me also a very important KPI there.
Yeah, and most of the projects really had, from a schedule perspective, had either no impacts to their completion dates as a result of COVID or very limited impacts. So I think they were able to, I think in almost every country, again, there were a couple of sections where jobs did get put on hold because the governments just, you know, shut down everything. But most of the projects, construction was considered an essential industry that was allowed to continue. And as a result, most of the projects were able to keep progressing at a reasonable pace. They did have to make some adjustments, but I think one of the things we've seen overall out of the pandemic in general was, you know, although there were some initial productivity impacts, it made all of us, I think, look at how we work and find ways to work smarter so that we could actually increase productivity. On one hand, you know, you have to, and Google was willing to pay for additional equipment that contractors may need to bring on because they couldn't put 2 people in. But then actually what the offset of that is, in some cases, you actually had increased productivity per person, per man hour, because you had more equipment and different ways of working. So, you know, I think there were some interesting lessons learned off of all of that.
Interesting. Did you, I still have some questions and we're gonna get some audience questions as well. I'm gonna show them at you in a moment. But I was wondering, as we were discussing and explaining how you went through those issues, did the projects suffer or were impacted like the same way across the world, or did you find like specific types of issues in the US and some other types of issues in Europe and so on?
You know, that's a good question. In general, some of the impacts were very similar. I think almost every project implemented additional cleaning, additional personal protection equipment, additional sanitation facilities and other facilities to approach that. They almost all of them did temperature screening. So those were consistent across the entire portfolio. In fact, one of the things we did was actually get metrics off of different projects of what the cost was for doing some of these things, be it the daily cleanings or temperature screening, and actually we're able to identify some methods that were more cost effective than others. Some projects that had a lot of people on the job site would do these scanners that you walk through. And when you do that, it actually was much more cost effective to do that than to have someone manually stick the thermometer or the probe to your forehead and check your temperature that way, because you could move people into the job site much faster. But the other types of impacts really varied significantly. You know, in the US, most of the workers are relatively local to an area. So, and even then travel between states was really not an issue. So everyone was in country. But in Europe in particular, where, you know, there's so many countries close together, it's not uncommon for your workers to actually come from another country. Well, if they went home, they might not be allowed back for travel restrictions. Or if they were allowed back, they might have to go into quarantine for 14 days. So those types of restrictions were relatively unique in Europe. And it presented some challenges. One of the projects, the contractor, for some reason, took it upon themselves to actually charter a plane to bring workers back to the job site, some of the management staff. But they didn't ask anyone about doing that. And we were kind of like, I don't, that was an unreasonable cost, we felt like. But, you know, there were so many complications to all of that. One of the projects, the workers went home and they couldn't come back. So they actually had to find workers from another source. So, and that changed their cost as a result of that. So there were a lot of unique circumstances. In Asia, some of the projects there were just shut down for many months. And we didn't have anything like that in the US. So there were definitely some differences in different parts of the globe.
I'm going to have another productivity question, but before that, one of the questions from the audience, it might be a doubt of some of more people, so I'll just ask now. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of projects were there? I mean, are they all data centers, or they have labs as well, some other types of facilities like office buildings and so on?
No, this was all just for data center projects. We did actually, so that was where the majority of Google's capital spend was this past year. We did coordinate with some of their other capital programs in terms of office spaces and other facilities that they have, and shared what we were doing with them so that they could take some of the same approaches and build on what we used or developed. But our focus was really all just on the data center programs. Most of it was on the construction of new data centers, but some of it was on ongoing works projects that occur after they're built and operating.
Okay, thank you. So back to the productivity question. You mentioned that some new practices were either developed or better understood or better planned, and you were able to achieve better productivity in certain projects, in certain activities. Are there any specific lessons learned that can and probably will impact the industry going forward? So after we have COVID and now we don't need to have the restrictions anymore, people can be closer together. So should we expect an increase in productivity, across the board with from some of those experiences?
I certainly hope so. I think there's, I think one of the things that will come out of this that could potentially in the long run drive greater productivity is better measurement and tracking. In the US, the National Electric Contractors Association, NECA, published some early findings from a study they did showing some productivity impacts. But one of their findings was that contractors need to do a better job of measuring their own productivity, tracking their installation of quantities, and being able to report on that type of information so that then they're, in the instance where they are impacted, they're actually able to provide the evidence to support that. But I think anytime that you measure your productivity and can understand how you're performing in different areas, it leads to improvement. So I think that's going to be an opportunity for that. And I think we are going to recognize that there are some trade-offs, with different ways of working. Some of the things I think that potentially the social distancing could continue in some form or fashion for many years to come. Because if it's not this pandemic. It could be COVID-20 or something else. So I think we're going to try to incorporate some of these lessons learned into our day-to-day work practice going forward.
Nice. Also, I'm with you. I hope some of the lessons learned can improve overall productivity for the industry itself. I mean, it's the industries that lags behind in terms of improving productivity levels over the years. A question from the audience as in relation to how did Google treat not force majeure, but COVID, sorry. Was it treated as a force majeure issue overall, or was there like different treatments, different contracts? What was that dealt with?
There's probably some details in answering that question that I may not be allowed to divulge without killing everyone that's listening to this. But in general, I think when we developed this set of positions, the general guideline was if the contractor was acting in response to either government requirements or government recommendations, Google would pay for that. If they were doing something in response to a Google direction or Google practice, then Google would pay for it. So it was really only in the instance of, if the contractor did something on their own without any consultation, they just decided that it was a good idea, that then it might be questionable as to whether or not Google would pay for it. Now, ultimately, I think in almost all cases, if Google found what they did was reasonable, they compensated the contractor for it without any question. So really, in many ways, I think the force majeure aspect of that never really came up so much. So they never really treated it in that fashion.
Thank you. You don't need to kill anyone. Thank you for answering like that. We have a question from Eduardo Crispin. He said, you mentioned sanitary costs and force majeure, but what about COVID claims related to price escalation caused by the COVID economic crisis? I think it has a bit to do as well with the, perhaps you want to touch base as well on the logistics aspect of it, lack of materials and so on, and price escalation. And
we really never received any contract requests with that type of impact. I think, now in the US, we're starting to see impacts like in the lumber market, of all things. But really there was nothing of that sort that was submitted by any of the contracts. I think the only instance they had was actually dealing with labor rates, where they wanted to pay the workers more money because the government in this was actually in the US, in one of the states, was providing assistance for those people that had been laid off. So in some cases, workers could stay home and not work, and they could get like 70% of their normal income. And many of them decided, well, I'll just stay home rather than go back to work. So the contractor wanted to pay more money in that instance. So I think that's really the only instance that I can think of where price escalation was an issue.
Yeah, that question is interesting, and it's a reality that took place a lot in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So the real estate market went through some sort of boom in different things, like not only workforce, but also materials.
Okay. Yeah, we are starting to see some secondary impacts on that, but it's not in this industry. It's more in like the housing industry here.
Yeah, fair enough. Another question is more, I guess, generic in terms of dispute resolution mechanisms. Would like to hear more about your experience and what you have seen Google or not related, really, in terms of the utilization of dispute boards in those construction contracts. You see them often, how popular they are, you know, if you have a personal experience and or point of view to share.
Use of dispute courts?
Sorry, dispute boards.
Dispute boards.
Yeah.
You know, so I've actually testified in a few instances, always in arbitration. So that's the one I'm most familiar with. It's actually, oddly enough, all of those testimonies were in Mexico under the International Chamber of Commerce arbitration rules. But I think there's definitely a growing move in private contracts, at least, to use dispute boards or dispute resolution in lieu of litigation. And most of the contracts actually have written in there that you will use mediation or arbitration as the means for resolving any disputes. So I think the goal is to keep it out of the court system.
Fair enough. I'll try it anywhere. All right, let me see if I just have other questions. I guess, well, we have another 5 minutes, and if there are more questions, I'll ask them. But in the meanwhile, perhaps, you know, you can tell us a little bit about, because that's also what we want to do as part of these interviews. We want to learn, obviously, about your experience. We want to be able to share what you've been doing and seeing in some places, so that other people in other places who are hopefully members of the AACE, they're not yet members, the audience, please become members. So if you're not there yet, please do so. We've also learned to learn from the person who is being interviewed about their experience as a member, right? So
I joined AACE about 20 years ago. A gentleman I was working for at the time, I was working on a project and they were doing something interesting on it. And he said, we should write a paper about this. And so we ended up co-authoring a paper and submitting it to AACE. That was back in 1999. It was a really interesting experience, and I have done now about a dozen papers since then. And it's been really, I think, a very fulfilling experience. I think my interaction with the people at AACE has been extremely rewarding in terms of my personal growth as well as career development. I think Martin Darley, who's a former president, who also lives in Houston, is actually responsible for my current job with Turner & Townsend. So he was working for Turner & Townsend at the time, and he asked me to come and interview. And so I think from my perspective, I think the value associated with AACE can be can take multiple facets. One is just your own personal career development, your networking, your growth, and in terms of, you know, we have so many great technical documents that you can learn from and how to practice something. But the people that you can meet in this association are really, some of them are my best friends now. And maybe that's sad in some ways, I don't know. But it is also people that I can trust and ask questions about, about either technical issues or even get advice in my career. And maybe now I'm at the point now that I'm giving advice to others as on the back end of my career. So I find that really to be some of the great aspects. But the other aspect of that is from a business perspective. I think businesses that get involved with AACE, one, it's a great recruiting venue. The people you know through AACE, at some point or another, they're maybe ready for a new opportunity, and so I've connected with a number of people through AACE and brought them to Turner & Townsend, or people that were looking have gone to other organizations based on people they knew. But then also the businesses can use AACE practices to help their business. If you follow these practices, presumably you should have better performance on your projects and better utilization of your capital. So I think that's a lot of the benefit that you can get out of this association.
It was a bit of a biased question. You're the president, but I truly believe in what you're saying. I do. So thank you. Aldo, I don't know if you can hear us. Perhaps you can join us to close the interview. We are getting close to the time, to the full hour, even though we started a little late. I wouldn't mind. That was for technical reasons, so we don't want to expand the time with the audience and with you, Chris. It's getting late here in Brazil.
I have my wine, so I can go as long as you need.
Okay, I don't know if Aldo is joining us or not now.
So I'm drinking my favorite wine at this point. It's a Spanish Rioja, the Marquise de Marietta. I had this for the first time like 20 years ago when I went to Madrid. And I would always, whenever I went to Madrid, I'd always bring back a couple of bottles in my suitcase. And so now I finally found someone who sells it in Houston, so I can get an endless supply.
Good. Sounds really good.
That's the most important thing you'll get out of this conversation. Good wine recommendation.
I see Aldo is here, so I will, from my side, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Aldo.
Dear Chris, I would like on behalf of AACE Brazil section, I would like to thank you very much for your delightful presentation and chat with all the members of our section and other sections as well. And I hope to see you personally here in one of our events, hopefully in December here in Brazil.
That would be nice. Actually, so Turner & Townsend has an office, our headquarters in Brazil is in Sao Paulo. So maybe I can come down there and see you then.
Okay, Philip, so please your final words, and then we can close the session.
Okay, now thank you everybody. Thank you so much again. Thank you all for organizing this and making this a reality, this program. And thank you, the audience. And I'm sorry you can hear now my fire alarm going on, so I'll have to turn off anyway and see what's going on. All right, guys.
Thank you for having me.
You all have a great one.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.